Okay, here we are again. Wow, how's the weather down there? I guess the roads are in bad shape. Luckily, we're online for this class, but you never know. A couple of the other schools that I teach at, we're required to go online just for this one last time because the weather and the roads are in such bad shape. I've seen pictures of the city. Apparently, the subways are all flooded out and the highways, and it's a mess. It's just a mess. When you get a huge amount of rain all of a sudden after having already had a hurricane, that tends to be a problem. Okay. All right. So let's see. What should we do today? All right. First things first. We did not quite finish chapter 1. There's an appendix, which is just a brief look at some of the most important types of graphs that you'll run into throughout economics, not necessarily just this course, but all of them, because economics is often explained in terms of graphs because it's very useful and handy to be able to do so. All right, so let's take a quick peek at this. So yes, we were basically talking last time about scarcity and how choices are made under conditions of scarcity. The bottom line here is that resources are scarce, but people's wants are unlimited. The reality is we want everything. Okay, we can't have everything, but we want it. So the only thing that holds us back from having everything is the lack of resources. Of course, in other words, there's only so much of everything to go around. And so choices have to be made, decisions have to be made. We have to evaluate how much every product is worth to us before we decide what to buy. The goal is to maximize the value that we get for our money, and not just our money, but all of our other resources, especially time. Okay, in other words, you know that there's nothing worse than wasting time because you can't get it back. So you have to make sure that whatever activity you're involved with, it is putting your time to the best possible use. Otherwise, you'll end up with less than you would have liked. And so that's really what this chapter is all about. And so anyway, yes, and of course we introduced this concept of opportunity cost, which you'll be seeing a lot of. Basically, this refers to what did you give up when you made a decision. I think I mentioned the case of college. When you go to college, there's a lot of costs involved. You have to write a check to the school every year. You have to pay for the courses. You have to pay for the room that you're living in, presumably. You have to pay for the food. But what often is ignored is that you could have used that same time to work at a regular job and earn money. Now, of course, for most people, that would not make any sense because the amount of money you could earn would be very minimal, but it's not something that we need to ignore. We should ignore either because it is a true cost. In other words, you're giving up the opportunity to earn money while you're in school. Okay. And the same thing is true for all of your activities. I mean, when you decide to watch TV, that's time that you're not spending on other possibly more useful activities. So in other words, every time there's a choice, we have to take into account what else could we have been doing with those same resources. Otherwise, we're not going to make the right decisions. And we also talked about incentives. We assume that in economics, all people are rational and they respond to incentives. For example, we talked about cigarette taxes. The reason why cigarette taxes are so high is because the government is hoping to discourage people from smoking. Or I think I also mentioned the case of taxes in London on all cars that come into London. Literally, they have cameras sitting there, and every car that drives into London, a photograph is taken of their license plate and they're sent a bill. I don't know how much it is, but they're hoping to minimize the number of cars that come into London because, if you think Manhattan traffic is bad, you've never seen London. London is a much older city, as you know, than New York City. New York City, realistically, is only about maybe 300 years old max, if you include the Dutch. And the consequence of that is that the roads in London were originally cow paths. That's how cows wandered down to get something to drink or follow wherever they were going. So the roads are very narrow and twisty and windy, and let's just say it's not cool. New York City, at least, the streets are laid out in a nice grid. They're still very crowded, but I would say that it's easier to drive around in Manhattan than in London. And another thing that London has working against it is, unlike Manhattan, Manhattan is sitting on bedrock. And that's why it's possible to build such enormously tall buildings. And that means we can have enormous parking garages. London is sitting on top of chalk, and it's very soft. And so there's a limit to how tall they can build their buildings. And so they can't have these massive parking garages like we do in Manhattan. So all of that combined means that it's tough to deal with traffic in London. They have a huge population, and the reality is driving is a major headache. So the government of England, the British government, felt like the best way to minimize this problem is to simply tax people who come to the city. That way, people who have to get to their jobs will pay the tax and they'll continue to come into the city. But people who are just coming in just to have fun or something might decide to do something different. Now, if people didn't respond to incentives, then all of this would be a waste of time. I mean, the cigarette taxes wouldn't affect anything. The car tax in London wouldn't affect anything, but it's pretty clear that people do respond to incentives, especially economic incentives, because people do tend to be very rational when it comes to making decisions about their money. Okay, even people who are a little bit bizarre will probably not make strange choices with their money. Okay, that's a very different level. And anyway, we talked about the differences between macro and micro. Micro looks at the individual decision-making units. Macro is more a look at the big picture, concepts like inflation and interest rates and the size of the economy and the strength of the dollar, all of which we'll discuss as we go along. But the two of them were originally just one large discipline. It's only been really since the start of the 20th century that a distinction has been made between macro and micro. They really are the same field. It's just that, it's not that unusual to see them split up into these, okay, yeah, no, if you had trouble getting in, but as long as you're here now, that's fine. Okay, not a problem. All right. By the way, I was told by the school that some people might not have internet service, that I have to be aware of that. And you know how the internet can crap out when the weather's bad, or for lots of other reasons. It's not quite as reliable as we'd like to think it is. But so yes, I know that there are some people who may not be able to make it today. Yes, macro is the big picture. You can tell by that prefix, macro. Micro means we're looking, I guess you could call it the little picture. You're looking at individual decision-making units, households, businesses, consumers. How do they make decisions about how to allocate their resources? The macro economy, presumably, is just a result of all these decisions made by individuals, firms, and households. All right. So we'll look at all these questions as we go along. How is output measured? What causes inflation? What determines the level of interest rates? What determines the strength of the dollar? These are all very important macroeconomic questions. So we will, as we go along, discuss all of these. Micro, as I said, is looking at how much does a firm decide how much to produce. In other words, how does Starbucks decide how many cups of coffee to produce? How many units of Windows, or how does Microsoft decide how many units of Windows to sell? Or how does Apple decide how many iPads and iPhones to produce? Interesting questions. There's a lot of considerations that go into this, but they have to make the right decision. Otherwise, they'll end up losing money. How do individuals decide which goods to buy? Okay, well, you know what? That decision depends on a lot of factors as well, but ultimately, the consumer's job is to maximize the benefit of every dollar that they spend, okay, based on their individual tastes and situations. And also, how competitive is the market for goods? Some markets are very competitive. We see like fast food, for example, is a very competitive market. What other types of markets are not very competitive at all? There's just one or two major producers, and that's it. Okay, so these are really micro questions. We won't really be looking at these during the course. Well, maybe some of them, but we won't focus on them as much as macro. All right, finally, we get to look at graphs. Now, we're going to draw a lot of graphs in this class. They're not hard. Don't worry. You don't have to, be an artist or anything, but you also may be asked to interpret certain types of graphs that are more complicated. And our job here is to basically understand what these types of graphs are telling us. So in other words, anyone can produce a graph, but the important thing is being able to interpret it. That's really what this section is all about. Now, you may have run into these before. So let's take a look at these one at a time. A scatter plot. Now, what is a scatter plot? In a case like this, what we're trying to do is analyze the relationship between two different variables. Okay, so let me just quickly show you what that looks like. Imagine that we have a situation where we're trying to figure out what is the relationship between a corporation's profits and their sales. So sales is on the horizontal axis and profits are on the vertical axis. And the reason why we're setting it up this way is because we're assuming that the profits depend on the sales, not the other way around. So the horizontal axis or x-axis contains what we would call the independent variable. The vertical or y-axis contains what we will call the dependent variable. So because it's our belief that profits are determined by sales, that's why profits are on the vertical axis and sales are on the horizontal axis. Now, each one of these points represents 1 year worth of sales and profits. And if you look at the pattern here, what you're going to see is that along the horizontal axis, as the sales increase, the vertical axis also increases. In other words, when sales rise, there's a very strong tendency for profits to rise as well. Although the relationship isn't perfect. Okay, in fact, what you could do is draw a straight line between these points. And the equation of this straight line would actually give you a forecasting tool where you could say, for example, what happens if sales go up to $21 million next year? What do I expect the profits to be based on this past history that I have? So this is a very useful tool, but it's really only meant for analyzing two different variables. Okay, if I only am interested in one variable, this would not be the way to go. So we see a lot of this in economics because we're often analyzing the relationship between variables like profits and sales. Or how about this one? How about sales and advertising? A corporation may decide that they want to know if advertising is a good investment. You know that every day you're bombarded with ads on TV. The question is whether it's working. Oh, by the way, I just want to point out one thing here. On this graph, if you notice, we're only looking at the first quadrant here. Remember, in the XY coordinate system, this is the first quadrant. This is where both X and Y are positive. For many variables, there's no negatives. So therefore, we'll stick to the first quadrant, okay? And so here, this is no exception. And so imagine that we've decided to focus our attention on advertising versus sales. Now, in this case, we have to make a decision which variable belongs on the horizontal axis and which one belongs on the vertical axis. So I'm going to leave it up to you to decide which it is. Which one belongs in the x-axis? Who wants to go out there to tell me which belongs in the X? Is it advertising or sales? Okay, Fernando, what do you think?
I think that the advertising would be the independent variable, and I think the sales would be the dependent variable.
Okay, I see. Devin, I didn't notice your hand up. Did you want to say something?
I was going to say the exact same thing that
Okay,
he
good.
said.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so the whole point of this is that presumably your sales will depend, at least to a certain degree, on your advertising. Otherwise, what's the point? Okay, in other words, yes, those ads are expensive, Every time you see a Geico ad, they're spending a lot of money. Why? What do they hope you'll do? Why would the Geico put an ad on TV? Watching that little lizard running around. What is the purpose of that?
Because they want you to, oh,
My bad.
sorry.
Sorry. Bro.
Oh, I was gonna say because they want you to buy their stuff. They depend on you, so they need the advertising, the independent variable, to get
Exactly.
you, the consumer, which is the dependent.
That's right. Exactly. Were you going to say that, Fernando? This is kind of an odd setup because we can't see each other. Oh, good. Yes, exactly. So yes. So anyway, so I'll try to be careful. I've noticed that it used to be, I don't know what happened, when somebody was trying to raise their hand, there is a little message, but when there's a chat, this little box used to light up, and it doesn't seem to do that anymore for some reason. So if I don't see your chat right away, I apologize, because I'll try very hard to keep an eye on it. I don't want to overlook anyone. Okay. So anyway, you can imagine that if I took, this could end up looking something like this, which simply means that there's a positive relationship between the two. More advertising typically triggers more sales, although it's not a perfect relationship. Otherwise, all these points would be on this line, which, by the way, has a special name. It's called a trend line. And so this means, well, maybe we're not wasting our money. If Geico spends more money on advertising, more people will buy their insurance. If not, then they're wasting their money. So, which is interesting, because what that means then is that if you continue to see ads from the same company, that means that it's working, because otherwise they would pull the plug on it right away. So if you constantly see ads from Geico, it means that their advertising is working, because it is a very expensive thing to put things on TV like that. All right. Now, there's a million other examples we could come up with. You could also have two variables that are going in opposite direction. In other words, look at this one. Down here on the horizontal axis, we have competitor sales. So imagine that you are, let's say you're Dunkin' Donuts, and you're competing head to head with Starbucks for the sale of coffee. If Starbucks sales go up, most likely that'll eat into your sales, because the reality is there's only so much coffee that we can sell. There's only so many people in the market. So there's going to be a tendency for our sales to drop when our competitors go up. So in a case like this, if you notice, the slope of this trend line is negative, in the sense that as X increases, Y decreases, and vice versa. Okay, that's an important piece of information, and many variables are related this way. Okay, so up here we had a positive relationship. Here it's negative. Okay, so the scatter plot will help us identify which type of relationship we actually have, and also how strong it is. Now, sometimes we have two variables that really are not related to each other at all. That's also a possibility. And then when that happens, the graph looks like a random scattering of dots. Now here, I've got rainfall on the horizontal axis and profits on the vertical axis. So imagine this is Microsoft. Why in the world would rainfall influence their profits? It wouldn't. So these two variables are unrelated to each other. In fact, if I try to draw a line through the points, well, it's going to be pretty far away from all the points. So the two variables are either unrelated or independent of each other. And that's an important piece of information to know. All right, so you may think that certain things are influencing your profits, and maybe it turns out that they're not. Like if this was the case for profits in advertising, would you continue to spend money on advertising? As let's say you're Geico and you get this plot with profits and advertising. No, because this means you're wasting your money. That the amount of insurance people buy does not seem to depend on how much we advertise. Now, speaking of that, it's interesting that if you watch TV long enough and you look at the ads, you'll notice there's a handful of businesses that tend to advertise most of, or let's say most of the ads you see on TV tend to come from a few different industries. Insurance is certainly one of them. Also, you sometimes see ads for high-tech goodies, new products. You also tend to get a lot of household products like toothpaste, for example, and mouthwash and stuff like that. But there's others that you don't tend to see a lot of. It used to be, you used to see a lot of ads for fast food, like McDonald's used to be advertising all the time. And now you don't really see that very often. I have a feeling that they've reached the point where everybody knows who McDonald's is, and Burger King and Wendy's and all the rest. And so that advertising isn't really bringing people in any longer, because they already know what the store is and what they have. The advertising in a lot of ways is designed to introduce a product to people that may not know about it. But once they know about it, then the advertising itself may not be helpful any longer. So I'll tell you one thing that's never on TV. Fernando, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
So that's the case. Advertising is used to introduce, but
Right.
If it's not like, like you said for McDonald's, if it's not like they're not advertising enough, wouldn't that also like affect their business, like not benefit them?
Well,
Would
I guess,
like have a
yeah,
have a or a positive effect?
it's probably reached the point where the advertising itself is no longer needed because everybody knows who they are. If it's it's interesting how this comes and goes in cycles. It used to be that McDonald's and Burger King were on TV all the time, and it just sort of fell off. And I'm sure that that's the reason, because it's gotten to the point where everybody knows who they are, and the advertising isn't helping to bring more people in the door anymore, unless they have some new promotion going on, which they want to make sure everyone is aware of, or especially if they bring out a new product. Like if one day McDonald's suddenly says, you know what, look what we did. We went out and got ourselves a liquor license, and now you can have beer at McDonald's. That would be on TV all the time. But no, I think that it's reached the saturation point, so that there's no point in spending so much money anymore in advertising, especially because fast food, the reality is it's a kind of business where they make their money with volume. I mean, when you go into a McDonald's, you buy a burger with soda and fries, and you're only spending $5 or whatever it is. The amount of profit they're making on each sale is pretty small. So the way they make up for that is volume. So their job is to sell a massive quantity of burgers and fries, but keeping their costs to an absolute minimum. And that's how they make their money. So advertising, unless it's really clearly working, they're probably not going to waste their money on it. So, but on the other hand, relatively new companies do need you to find out who they are. And so they are really more likely to advertise on TV so that you find out that they exist in the first place. You never know what you're going to see in these ads. Now, of course, in this day and age, a lot of advertising takes place on the internet. You may have had this experience. Suppose you go to a website and you look at new cars. Let's say you're thinking about buying a new car. Then you go to ESPN.com to look at the Yankees game, and all of a sudden there's an ad for that car that you were just looking at. How did that happen? Somehow they know. Somebody is paying attention to what you're looking at on your computer, and somehow those ads find themselves in the most interesting places. Have you ever noticed that? Well, it happens to me all the time. Because you go look at one page and you're like, okay. In fact, in one of my classes, I was showing them some historical notes and coins. And then when I went back to some other websites, there were ads for coin companies that were trying to sell me historical notes and coins because they thought I was trying to buy them. Okay. So, all right. Anyway, so scatter plots. Oh, by the way, is anyone here majoring in economics? I think I asked the other day. Fernando, you are? Anyone else? Olivia? Okay, good. The only reason I mention that is because sooner or later, you're going to be asked to take statistics if you haven't already. And when you do get to statistics, this will prove to be, Jeremy, oh, you got two hands. I hope that means you're happy with your major. This will prove to be an extremely important idea in statistics class, okay? So just be aware, economics is heavily based on statistics. If there's one field you need to be good at to be an economist, it is statistics, okay? Because everything is done with statistics. All right, now what else do we have? Oh, here we go. This is an interesting idea, the time series graph. What you're trying to do here is look at how a variable changes over time. And so you can see now this is a corporation, this is a plot of its profits over time. Are you happy, if you're the corporation, are you happy with this graph? Well, let's put it this way. Are the profits rising over time? Yes. Now, I mean, yes, maybe they would have preferred that the profits grow a little faster. And there was this big slump in 2014, but in general, you can see the trend is up. The profits are rising over time. And this is the easiest way to see how a variable is changing over time. Just plot it out. We call this a time series plot because the horizontal axis is time. Time is considered to be the independent variable. Well, you know what? You can't really, yes and no. In order to decide if the trend is strong, you really have to compare your trend with the competitors in your industry. Okay. In other words, if this is a fast food company, then what's relevant is how fast are the sales growing for other fast food companies. It would not be a good move to compare this to the growth of, let's say, software companies or car companies, because they're all very unique situations. So you would normally compare this to your own past history, but you would also compare it to other companies in the same industry to determine if your growth is strong or not. Okay, but for sure, profits are going up, and at least that much we can say. And it's hard to be unhappy about that. It's like your salary. It's going up. Well, maybe you would prefer to go up 10% a year, but it's only going up 6%. Well, that's still 6%. Okay, so this is an easy way to tell what's happening over time. Again, this is something you'll see a lot of in statistics. And then bar charts. These are a good way to organize information into categories. Okay, so here's what I mean by that. This bar chart represents the distribution of my profits over the last so many years. What is that? 40 years. Okay, so I took 40 years worth of profits. These were all in millions of dollars. And what you'll notice is that each bar represents a range of profits. So for example, this one right here represents profits between 30 and $40 million. And that's happened 5 times in the last 40 years. So the great thing about this bar chart is that I can see that the most common outcome was 50 to $60 million a year. The least common was 10 to 20. Okay, so in other words, it's a quick and easy way of looking at a lot of data in a hurry and seeing how much or how often these different outcomes took place. You often see this used to represent distributions of grades, let's say. You can easily imagine something like this. Suppose I took a class and said, all right, what's going on in this class? I would put, so the grade would go here, and the vertical axis is the frequency. So let's say here's are my A's, B's, C's, D's, and F's. So that means that luckily not that many people failed. Most of the people in this class got a C, but there's a lot of A's and B's as well. So this is a bar chart. Often in economics, this is referred to with the name histogram. It's a special type of bar chart. It's frequently used in economics to look at data and understand the relationship between these categories and their frequencies. All right, so I think that's enough for chapter 1. Now, as it turns out, I do have a handful of very useful, interesting videos that we will see throughout the course. So I'm going to start with one today. And it's called, Why Should You Study Economics? So now, in order to do this properly, what we have to do, I know this from experience. If I try to show it to you directly on my screen, you may not be able to hear the sound. Also, we could run into copyright problems because I'm recording this thing. So what I'm going to do is send the link to you by the chat room. And when it gets there, what I want you to do is turn it on and watch it. Okay, this one I think is about 3 or 4 minutes long. So why don't we watch this on our own computers and we'll discuss it when it's over. Okay, so I'm going to pause the screen again because of copyright issues, and then we're going to all watch it. All right, well, that was interesting. Now that one, as far as I know, that was done by students in a class somewhere. It was obviously in England. You know, I can tell two hints. Number one, in Britain, they call gas petrol, short for petroleum. And number two, they mentioned the Bank of England in there. So yeah, these are British students, I believe. It was kind of silly, but it was also kind of interesting because if you notice, no matter what this guy is doing, somehow it's related to economics. And you'll find that out yourselves as you get along, that everything in the real world has in some important way related to economics. So the more you understand it, the better off you'll be. Okay, like with his mortgage payments, you know, he may have been able to make some kind of an important decision or take some steps to protect himself from the higher interest rates if he understood what he was doing. So, you know, it's not just about abstract ideas, but things that directly affect you every single day. All right, but anyway, so that was the first. Now there's another one here that we can watch, which is more about what economics itself is as a field. Okay, so why don't we check this one out? I'll send it off to you by the chat room. And then we'll watch it and see how we like it. All right, let's do it. Oh, that was it. Okay. That was a weird ending. All right, is everyone done? Well, yeah, so that was a pretty good review of what we just did in the first class, just a broad look at the field, but it also gave us some key insights into how it can be applied to so many different fields that are not really, strictly speaking, economics or finance. Like you mentioned, sociology and criminology and all those different fields can all be tied back into economics, because ultimately economics is about human behavior. It just so happens that it focuses on a particular type of behavior, but still, um, a lot of laws are written with economic principles in mind. For example, the criminal laws are designed to minimize the incentive to commit crimes. I mean, that's the whole point. It's not just about punishment, but maybe encouraging people not to commit crimes. So it's a very much more, let's say, broad field than it might seem at first. In fact, there's several economists who have made their name by writing about things that you would have no idea had anything to do with economics. Like one famous economist, Gary Becker, wrote a series of papers about things that, like the economics of marriage, for example. Who would think that you could analyze marriage in terms of economics? But he actually is able to do that, because a lot of the decisions do ultimately come down to money, don't they? So, all right, anyway, so that's it for our videos for today. We have plenty more, but just not for today. So now it's time to get to chapter 2. Let's see what this is all about. All right, so this is a big picture look. We're going to introduce the more concepts in this topic. We'll have a little bit of discussion about the global economy, but a lot of that discussion will come later in the course. We're definitely going to spend time talking about international economics, as it's called, which involves the trade of goods and services with other countries, and which is a very interesting area of study. As you probably know, the U.S. does an enormous amount of trade with foreign countries. In fact, we do most of our trade with one other country. Does anyone know what that other country is? Who do you think is our major trading partner?
China.
It's China, that's right. Although that's a relatively recent development. It used to be Canada until fairly recently. Now China has moved into first place. We do tons and tons of trade with China. The U.S. imports billions and billions of dollars worth of goods from China every year, and we sell billions of goods back to the Chinese as well. So that we will discuss later on in the course. So now what we want to do is introduce this very interesting model of how the economy functions. It's a graph that tries to illustrate the flow of goods and services throughout the economy. And so we're going to start by assuming that all the goods that are produced in the economy fall into one of two categories. Now, obviously, businesses produce consumer goods for sale to individuals like you and me. But they also produce what we'll call capital goods. Now, that's an important word, capital. Sometimes you run into words in English that can have many different meanings, and this is one of them. Here, what we're specifically referring to is goods that are meant to be used by businesses to produce consumer goods. So let me just give you a quick example of this. Starbucks, they produce coffee for us. Okay, fine. Everybody loves Starbucks. Well, pretty much everybody loves Starbucks. You go into Starbucks, you buy coffee, you taste it, it's wonderful, and so you come back for more the next day. But in order to sell you that coffee, there's a lot of steps involved, and many of them involve machinery. Like, for example, the coffee pot, the coffee urn, I guess you would call it, where the coffee is actually made, is a piece of machinery which Starbucks has to buy from a manufacturer. Without that, it would be difficult or impossible for them to brew up the coffee for you. So the urn, or the machine that's used to actually brew the coffee, is known as a capital good. Starbucks bought it for the express purpose of producing coffee for sale to consumers. Or let's see, what would be another good example? Blenders. They have blenders in Starbucks. What are they for? For the frozen drinks. Now, a blender could both be a consumer good and a capital good. Why? Because if it's sold to an individual, if you buy a blender and make frozen drinks at home, then that could be defined as a consumer good. But if Starbucks buys that same blender and uses it to produce a product to sell to the public, then we call it a capital good. Okay, so even though it's the same good, it's the usage of it that determines if it's a consumer good or a capital good. Now, capital goods are typically bought by businesses, of course. Consumer goods are bought by individuals. So there's a need for both of these in the economy. Some companies focus on producing capital goods, and some focus on producing consumer goods. So consumer goods, as I've just said, are bought by individuals, and they can include things like cars and furniture and appliances and food and you name it. Anything that people buy is considered to be a consumer good, unless it's being used to produce goods for other consumers. So like this car, what if you bought this car because you want to be an Uber driver? Well, then we're starting to get into some gray territory here. If you use the car only as an Uber driver, then it suddenly becomes a capital good because it's being used as a business. If your car is just being used for your own purposes, then we could think of it as a consumer good. Okay, so to a large degree, the distinction between consumer and capital goods depends on the usage that they're being put to. Now, the consumer goods that are purchased in the United States make up about 2/3 of the economy. Okay, in other words, if you look at all the values of all the goods and services that are produced in the US economy, roughly 2/3 of them were intended for the consumer market. Now, if you look at all the things you buy on a regular basis, some of these goods are fairly inexpensive and we buy them on a regular basis. Like food and gas and clothes, the things you buy on a regular basis, these are usually inexpensive enough that you don't necessarily need to finance them with credit. You might, but it isn't necessary. But what about the more big ticket items? The things you only buy very occasionally and are meant to last a very long time. Like cars. How often do you buy a new car? Not very often. Well, all right, I shouldn't say not. Some people need a new car every couple of years, but for the most part, when you buy a car, your plan is to keep it for several years. Furniture, that's meant to last a very long time. How often do you replace your couch, for example? I mean, not very often. Appliances like refrigerators. These types of goods are much more expensive and they are almost always financed with credit. Okay, so economists make a distinction between these two types of goods. In fact, let me slip this in here. We'll see this again later on, but I want to mention it now. Inexpensive goods. Well, let's put it this way. Expensive goods that tend to be financed with credit and have long lifetimes are known as durable goods. The word durable, of course, means something that's strong or solid. Inexpensive goods that are not always financed with credit and have short lifetimes are known as, very simply, non-durable goods. So pretty much all goods that you might buy fall into one of these two categories. Now, why does this matter to economists? I'll tell you why. What if you read in the Wall Street Journal that the economy is about to slow down? that for some reason the economy is running into trouble, would that make you think twice about buying a new car? No, no, okay, well, maybe not if you've got plenty of money. But many people would say, you know, I'm worried about losing my job. Maybe I'd better hang on to my old car for a little bit longer because I don't want to start making expensive car payments just as I'm losing my job. So yes, it will make you think twice. Oh, spending is wonderful for the economy, but here's the problem. When people get nervous, they cut back on their spending, and then the economy starts to slow down, and then that causes problems. So to a large degree, the economy depends heavily on confidence, consumer and business confidence. When consumers and businesses are nervous, that means that they start spending less and the economy starts to slow down. So that's how recessions get started. And we'll talk about that as we go along. Initially, some problem occurs in the economy, people start getting nervous. And so actually, the interesting thing is people's salaries tend not to fall during a recession. The unfortunate reality is either they keep their jobs or they don't. Usually if there's, yes, well, that too. But so normally what happens is if you're lucky enough to keep your job, you'll still get the same salary. But if you lose your job, that's it, you have nothing. So the demand for durable goods depends very heavily on confidence and the state of the economy. It can fluctuate a lot from one year to the next. So like during the COVID, the sales of these goods would have suffered because people were nervous. They weren't sure what to expect. On the other hand, we have inexpensive goods like food, groceries. Would you stop buying groceries if the economy was slowing down? No, you have to eat. So these types of goods would not be affected as much, at least, by a crisis like the COVID. So this is why economists make a distinction between these two, because our behavior, as far as our purchasing of these goods, depends on whether they are expensive and long-term or not. Okay, so most recessions get started when people stop buying durable goods. Okay, now the capital goods, these are meant for businesses, and the only reason they buy these is to produce consumer goods, okay? Buildings. Obviously, to run a business, you have to have a building. Now, you can rent it, but you also might want to buy it. And so let's say you buy an office building in Manhattan and you're going to use that to produce software. Well, that is a capital good because you're buying the building not to live in it, but to produce goods and services. And, you know, all kinds of equipment, like if you're a farmer, you need a lot of specialized equipment to plant the crops and harvest them. Machinery, like if you're running an auto body shop, you have all kinds of tools and machines laying around and tools. So these are all things that were bought by businesses typically just to sell consumer goods and services. Yeah, so like, you know, the Starbucks is one of my favorite examples, as you can tell. You can't do everything by hand in the Starbucks. It doesn't work that way. They need the coffee bean grinders. They need, you know, blenders. They need the espresso machines. They have the coffee pots. You know, there's a lot of equipment involved in the Starbucks. Those are all capital goods. And by the way, just to get a little ahead of ourselves, this is one of the reasons why interest rates have such a huge impact on the economy. Because if you're going to be borrowing money to buy durable goods, the interest rate that you have to pay to borrow that money will have a major impact on how much it costs you. Especially with something like a house. Even the difference between 0.25% can have a huge impact on the monthly payments. So when interest rates go up, that discourages people from buying durable goods, and it also discourages businesses from buying capital goods. So interest rates, as we'll see later on in the course, prove to be one of the most important macroeconomic variables. Even small increases in interest rates can have a huge impact on the economy. But at the same time, though, even small decreases in interest rates can have a huge effect on the economy. So that's one of the areas that we'll focus on. The last couple of chapters are about the Federal Reserve System, which is the one that ultimately determines the level of interest rates in the economy. Okay, so we're saving that towards the end. But now in advance, we already start to understand why interest rates are just so important. All right, now decisions have to be made. Now businesses are, the reason why business exists is to make money. So when they decide how to produce their products, their number one priority is to be able to do this as inexpensively as possible. Okay, so like imagine a McDonald's. They have tons of equipment in there so that the employees can make the food quickly and easily. But the McDonald's is not going to want to spend any more money than is absolutely necessary on this equipment, because that eats into their profits. Okay, it's like imagine if there was a McDonald's owner and he was crazy and he said, you know, I want the French fry baskets to be made out of gold. Well, he could certainly do it, but what an unbelievable waste of money. Oh, is that right? They're not good with maintaining the equipment?
Yeah, they don't, when something's broken, the employees can fix it if they want, but like the manager,
So
whoever, never ever spends money on maintaining it.
what do they actually do then? I mean, they can't just not use the equipment.
So like if the ice cream machine is broken, right, unless I guess the manager gets some money from what, like a corporate, I don't know, because it's like the manager owns the restaurant,
Yeah,
will never pay for it out of pocket. So it'll stay broken until he gets money to fix it.
really. But then in the meantime, he loses all the ice cream sales.
But in the meantime, the employees are expected to like take the ice cream bag out and like do it more by
Oh,
yeah.
I don't like that idea. I think that's counterproductive in the long run because, first of all, you're going to take a lot more time to make it and it's not going to be the same quality.
Yeah,
I
it's
mean,
really dumb, but that's what happens because McDonald's managers aren't, I guess, like, you know, economics majors or anything.
no, they're not. I guess you're right. They are not seeing the big picture, are they? Wow. And
That's all. They're just very greedy.
yeah, maybe they're just cheap people anyway to start with. I mean, you know how it is. It's like when you buy things, I mean, you often have to make a decision. Do you spend a lot of money on a high quality product or do you spend less money on a lower quality product? Like imagine this following scenario. You can spend 20 grand on a new car or 5 grand on a used car that has a lot of miles on it. A cheap person might think, oh, let's spend the 5 grand. It'll save so much money. Why might that not be a good move? What could go wrong with a $5,000 car?
It'll break faster.
Yes, and there will be a lot more repairs, and you might end up spending more money on the $5,000 car. I'm sorry, God, I can't find your hand. Somebody's got their hand raised, and I can't see it. Whoever it is, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna, well, she also took my answer. I was gonna say
Okay.
it's gonna cost more because if it breaks down, you have to repair it more.
Exactly. So
And,
in the short run, you might think you're saving money.
Yeah.
In the long run, you're not.
You're not.
That's a bitter experience that you will, a bitter life experience that you will have one day. You'll learn fairly quickly that in the long run, you really have to pay for the best. Get the best you can afford because it's going to cost you more if you don't. You know, it takes time for people to learn that lesson, but especially with cars, the expenses can really pile up like beyond belief. In fact, that's why leasing is so popular these days. I don't know if you know how that works. If you want to buy a new car, you have the option of leasing it, which means you're signing a 3-year contract, and basically you're paying less money, but you have to maintain it the way you normally would. Well, when the 3 years are up, you can either say, "Give me a new one and start a new lease," or "I'll buy this car that I've been leasing." And this way, if you choose, you can have a brand new car every 3 years. The only drawback is you never own it. And for a lot of people, that makes sense because, you know, whatever they're doing with the car, but it's an option And you might get that with the equipment at McDonald's. They might have the ability to lease the equipment rather than buying it. And so there's a lot of ways to work around this problem in the equipment maintenance, but I'm a little surprised to hear that the owner was that cheap. He's just say, oh, who cares? You know, I mean, that's your business. How can you be in business without having the proper equipment? I don't know, but it's a very short-sighted thing to do, in my opinion. Well, all right, anyway, so, but yes, our job is to use our resources. Now, in economics, all resources are typically broken up into these 4 basic categories. And so, for example, now we see them listed here: land, labor, capital, and the last one is entrepreneurship, which we'll discuss in a minute. But this really is the skill of bringing together resources in order to produce a successful business. We know a lot of entrepreneurs. They're very famous in our society. For example, Elon Musk, is he an entrepreneur? Yes, he started with nothing, and look at him now. How about Jeff Bezos? What is he so famous for? What did he do? Who is this guy, Jeff Bezos? Why is he so rich? Amazon, that's right. What a great idea that turned out to be. Bill Gates, who's no longer a part of Microsoft, but he invented Windows, and he made himself crazy rich. Well, maybe that too. That happens. Yeah, some of these guys are not so nice to their workers, but the idea here is that the company couldn't exist without their particular skill set. The resources don't combine themselves. Somebody has to have a vision and to create these products that we all know and love. But anyway, now land is actually used in a more general sense than just physical land. It actually refers to all natural resources like water and minerals and crude oil and air and plants and actual land too. You have to have some of these to make most products, maybe more so than we realize. So that's one of the key resources that we can use to produce products. One of the things that we have to watch out for, though, is that these resources are not, we can't actually produce more. If the world only has so much of the, so much water, so many minerals, so much land, for example. So you have to guard these very carefully. And in other words, use them in their best possible way. In other words, we want to use them as efficiently as we can. Hydroelectric plant. Now, I've seen this in Canada. The St. Lawrence River runs between the US and Canada, and on the Canadian side, the water gushes down the hills, and they can capture it with these hydroelectric plants and turn it into electricity. And it's all they're doing is capturing the water that's falling down the hills somehow, and that turns the turbines, and that in turn generates electricity. And so that's a classic example of natural resources being used to produce a product. Okay, in fact, they get a lot of their electricity. In fact, they have so much that they sell a lot of it to the United States. Pretty impressive. Now, everybody knows what labor is. Okay, labor, you can think of it as work, or any mental or physical activity that is used to produce goods and services. So obviously watching TV does not fall into this category. But for example, what if your job is to design apps for the iPhone? That would be an example of mental labor, okay? Because you're not doing physical work, you're sitting there thinking about what people want, and you're designing this thing and writing the code that goes along with it. Whereas fixing a car's engine is physical labor. Well, I guess even there's some mental activity, and you have to understand what you're doing. But they're both examples of labor, and we all have access to our own labor. That's a resource that in principle is renewable, because you can get up every day and work as hard as you want to. So anyway, that's a hugely important resource. Capital. Now, remember I said that the word capital can have multiple meanings. Here's a good example of what I meant by that. Capital can be defined. Now, by the way, this capital is the capital that's used to produce goods and services. We can subdivide it into physical capital, like machinery and equipment and buildings. Human capital includes a lot of other things that only people can have. For example, jump ahead here and show it to you. Skills and knowledge used to produce goods and services. That includes training and education and whatever it is that you need to produce something. So if you're a master craftsman and you produce, let's say, high quality watches, that's being produced with human capital. Or if you're a surgeon who's performing operations, that is human capital. You had to acquire that knowledge over many years of training, education, and experience. So that would be defined as human capital. Whereas physical capital is, like we talked about earlier, machines and equipment and buildings and that type of thing. So we have both. Now, over time, we can increase the amount of both physical and human capital that are available to us. For example, when, let's think of a good example. Let's say a company develops or builds a new laboratory to do research about life-saving drugs. That would be an example of an increase in our physical capital. Or what if students go to school and study and learn? That would be an increase in human capital. So the more knowledge a country has, the more knowledgeable the people in a country are, the more skills they have, the more talented they are. I mean, the more we'll be able to produce because we have all this, these resources available to us. So a country is always better off as its population becomes better educated and gains experience, because that means our human capital is going up. So by your being in school, you are contributing to the increase in human capital in the United States. Just think about that. You can walk around and say to people, you know what, I'm increasing the amount of human capital in the United States by being in school because I'm learning. And that's exactly what's happening. Now, I do want to make a distinction here. You may hear the word capital associated with what's called financial capital. If a corporation issues stocks to raise money, that is what we mean by financial capital. This is actually money. In other words, a company needs money to run its operations. Where do they get it from? Well, one of the ways they get it from is by issuing stocks to the public. So the funds that they raise that way will be called financial capital to distinguish it from these two types of capital. Okay, so you just want to keep an eye on that. So if you read, let's say in the Wall Street Journal, that a company is issuing or raising new capital by raising or selling stocks, they're talking about financial capital. And then entrepreneurship, well, we know these guys. They're the ones who bring the resources together to produce profits, and in the meantime, produce products that we all want. Like Stephen Jobs, who sadly passed away several years ago. If it weren't for him, we wouldn't have iPhones. If it weren't for Jeff Bezos, we might not be able to buy everything we want on the internet. If it weren't for Bill Gates, there may not be any PCs. So yes, they're crazy, crazy rich, but guess what? They produce something of incredibly important value to society. And so their reward for doing that is profits, large profits. Now, there's many entrepreneurs who didn't make any money. It's a very risky thing, but this is how new products, new ideas, new everything is developed through entrepreneurs. Okay, so that's important because without them, the other resources, it would do us no good. Somebody has to find a way to bring them together and produce the goods and services that we want. Now, here's some terminology. Of these four resources, all of them have a return, we call it. The owners of the land are considered to earn rent. Okay, we're going to use the rent in a general sense here, not necessarily apartment rent, but let's say you own oil or water or whatever it is. the returns to the owner of these resources is called rent. Now, labor, this is different. This is pretty straightforward. If you work, you get paid. And the payment you get is called a wage or a salary. The owners of physical and human capital are rewarded with interest, we will call it. And finally, entrepreneurs earn profits. Okay, that's what the game is all about, profits. Okay, like Jeff Bezos, you know, the richest man in the world at the moment. All of that comes from the profits from Amazon. So, by the way, here's an interesting fun side note. We all think that Bezos is so insanely rich. Let's see, I think right now, let's do this. Let's look at the top 10. Oh, I thought the numbers would be there, but. All right, 177 billion. Oh my God. Oh, there's a little story about each one of them too, so you know how they made their money. Wow. Yeah, look at that. Anyway, what I started to say though was that it turns out that there was an entrepreneur at the beginning of the 20th century who ultimately made these guys look poor by comparison. At one point, his net worth in today's money was estimated to be worth $660 billion. So the question is, who could this person have been? Well, I'm going to give you a hint. You may have heard about him, maybe you haven't. He made his money in oil. And their estates are still in New York. If you go through Westchester County, Rockefeller, yes, their home is still in somewhere near Tarrytown. It's open to the public. Yes, the Rockefellers, that's where they made their money. So, but this was more than 100 years ago. So in today's dollars, his wealth was worth approximately 660 billion, which means Jeff Bezos has a long way to go to catch up with him. Still, I think we'd all trade places with him in a minute. You know, look at that money. Man, wow. Zuckerberg, my niece's husband works at Facebook. He's met Zuckerberg. Apparently, Zuckerberg is just as strange a person as he comes across on TV. Whoops, did I say that out loud? We have Warren Buffett, one of the most successful investors of all time. Larry Ellison, who's founded Oracle. It's a database system. It's not something that individuals buy, but it's critically important for businesses. Oh, the founder of Google, Larry Page. What do you know? And another co-founder of Google. And I don't know this guy. Huh. All right. So there you go. So entrepreneurs, oh, does it? Oh, I didn't know. I don't know enough about this stuff, but I think originally it was a database system, but it's obviously something that's critically important for businesses, not just business. I'm sure that the school uses Oracle to keep track of all their information. It's really very widely used in everywhere, in all businesses, really. So anyhow, income distribution, this is always very controversial. In any society, income is going to be distributed unequally. Some countries more so than others. This is outdated data, but still you get the idea. Most people fall into this middle category. You can see this is a bar chart too, but it's lying on its side. The number of people who are up here are not that small, but the majority are clustered around the center here. But compared to most other countries, these numbers are quite high. The average income, household income in the United States is quite a bit higher than it is in most other countries. So things are fine, but you're always going to see that there's obviously more people in the middle than at either extreme. And then there's going to be a brief discussion here about the global economy. The US does a massive amount of trade with other countries throughout the world. According to statistics, as recently as 2016, the volume of global trade was just about $16 trillion. That's a lot of money. The question we want to ask ourselves here is, why do countries trade with each other in the first place? Why don't they just make everything themselves? What would be a good reason to trade with another country?
Because okay, I talk. Well, I'm already talking. Because some countries don't have the goods that other countries have. If you know what I mean.
Yes.
Like for example, in like let's say the Caribbean where there's fruits that doesn't grow in United States.
Right.
That would be a good reason to trade.
Exactly. Like, let's say bananas. Let's say bananas don't grow well in the United States. So why should we try to make our own bananas? Why don't we just buy them from Caribbean countries? And that's exactly what happens. Or coffee. I mean, some coffee does grow in Hawaii, but we import almost all of our coffee because it would be kind of a waste to try to plant it in the US where the weather isn't really appropriate. So why not just buy it from the countries where it grows well? And then from our side, we produce a lot of goods that other countries can't make. For example, aircraft. It's a very, very complex process making an airplane. And the US is very good at making airplanes. Boeing, for example, sells a lot of their planes to foreign countries because they just don't have the resources to make airplanes. So the US sells airplanes to other countries, and in exchange, we buy a lot of their products that they can make more cheaply than we can, or that maybe we can't make at all. So it makes sense so that everybody can specialize in what they're good at and buy the things that they're not so good at. And so this way, the economy of the entire world can grow. And so more and more trade takes place every year, and each country becomes more and more specialized. And this way, pretty much everybody benefits because we can have more goods and services at a cheaper price. A lot of things that we have here, we don't even realize that they're imported from other countries. In fact, all the clothes that you have in your closet, most likely they were manufactured in a foreign country, because clothing manufacturing involves a fair amount of manual labor. And that may be the case. Canada, because it's right next door to us, we do buy a lot of their oil. We buy, I mean, Canada is no longer a major trading partner. It's their number two. But we buy a lot of their products. Most of their products are sold in the United States because, well, we're right next door and we want what they have. So, yeah, Canada does sell us everything you can imagine, including oil. But so anyway, yes. So the point of trade is that why would you waste your time and resources producing things you're not good at when you can just buy them from foreign countries? And so that's how that works out. So every country can specialize in what they're good at. Another example is most of the world's vanilla comes from Africa. It just doesn't grow well in the US. So does a lot of the chocolate that we use. It's coming from Africa ultimately. So we buy it and then we sell them high-tech products that we can make very easily. And so it works out very well for the most part. Anyway, so yes, we'll have a more deep discussion of this later on in the course. But the funny thing is people in general aren't really aware of just how many products they buy that are actually imports. And because, it's not that obvious, but if you looked at the tags in any of your clothes and it mentions the country that it came from, almost certainly it's not going to be the US. The US makes very little, does not make a lot of clothes here because it's too expensive. Labor is very expensive in the United States compared to most other countries. So especially gigantic countries like India and China, the labor is quite cheap. So they tend to make products that require a lot of manual labor. Like Nike, for example, I think they make all of their sneakers in Indonesia or somewhere in that neighborhood. And it's again, it's all about the cost of the labor. So every country specializes in what they're good at, and then they can focus on that and just import what they need of all the rest. All right, now GDP. Now we're going to see a lot more about this later on. GDP stands for gross domestic product. That is the measure of how valuable all the goods and services we produce are during a given year. Maybe we can get newer data here. This is 2017, but it gives you a rough idea of how large the US economy is compared to most other countries. So in other words, in 2017, the value of everything produced in the United States was almost $20 trillion, okay? China was second, and you can see they're pretty far behind at about 11.8 trillion. Japan is third, you can see then Germany, the UK. So the US economy is by far the largest, but although China is catching up, you can see the other countries are doing well too, but they're still quite small compared to the US. Okay, so this just gives us a sense of how big the US economy really is. And it gets bigger every year, especially as we keep innovating and developing. That's where the US, the main strength of the US as an economy is in developing new products and new technologies that the rest of the world wants, like iPhones. I mean, can you imagine anybody on the planet who doesn't want an iPhone? I don't think so. So as long as the US can continue to produce things that everybody wants and stay ahead of the technology curve, the economy will just keep growing and growing and growing. And along with it, that means our standards of living will grow as well. Okay, so there's our affluence depends to a large degree on how efficient we are and how much we can continue to produce these new goods and services. All right, resources. Every country has different resources. Some countries have a lot of natural resources, some of them do not. Japan does not have a whole lot of natural resources. They don't have a lot of land either, although they're still very successful because they produce a lot of products that are more based on human capital, let's say. But some countries have a lot of natural resources and they can take advantage of that by selling them to countries that don't have them, like Russia has a ton of natural resources. They have oil and gas, and, you name it, and they make a lot of money by selling them to other countries like the US. China is the same way. They have a lot of minerals, rare metals and uranium, things that we need to manufacture specialized items. Like, for example, some of those special metals end up in computers. Some of them are used to make aircraft engines. And so those are important resources. Okay, now, who do we trade with? This is, again, slightly outdated information, but you can see China here is our #1 trading partner, closely followed by Canada and Mexico. And then we have Japan and Germany, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and France. This is who we're trading with. All right. Now, this is the graph that I mentioned earlier in the beginning. This is an attempt to show us how the resources flow throughout the economy. I don't know if it's the most useful graph we've ever seen, but we might as well just take a look at it. Most economics textbooks show this thing to you, just so you get a sense of how resources flow throughout the economy. I'm not going to stress it too much, but I think we should at least take a look at it. It's called the circular flow model of economic activity. And what it's doing is it's breaking up the economy into sectors. The sectors are households, goods markets. These are the markets where we buy goods and services. The factor markets are where businesses buy and sell resources like land, labor, and capital. We have firms who are producing goods and services, and we have the government. That's how this model works. Okay, so it's drawn in a big picture that shows you how resources flow between these different sectors. So in fact, let me skip ahead and show you what the graph looks like. All right, I hope you can read this if it's not too small on your screen. Households are up here, firms are down here. And then these are the two markets, the markets for goods and the markets for factors, by which we mean land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. So what they're trying to show you is that households buy goods and services. This red arrow means we spend money in the goods market, and that flows back into the firms in the form of revenues. The firms then hire resources like land, labor, and capital, for which they pay rent, wages, interest, and profits into the factor market. But the rent, wages, interest, and profits ultimately come from the households. So the payments go back to the households in the form of income, which can then be used to buy more goods and services. Okay, so in other words, the households are supplying resources to the businesses. And in exchange for that, the businesses are producing goods and services for us. That's really what this is all about. And then when we introduce the government into this picture, the government gets involved by taking taxes away from the households and firms, but they also send transfer payments back to some of the households and firms, but they also buy some of the goods and services in the marketplace. Okay, so the government is a customer, just like households. For example, they buy computers just like private businesses do. And so they're a major customer of the goods market, but they have to pay for it somehow, and that way is typically through taxes. All right, now in this last case, I think we're introducing the foreign sector. Yeah, you don't have to memorize any of this. This is just for your own benefit, just to see visually how factors flow or resources flow throughout the economy. And then, yeah, this is meant to be the picture of how we react to the rest of the world. We buy imports from foreign countries. We sell exports to foreign countries. And then this is where the imports and exports are financed with borrowing and lending. In fact, the US often borrows the money that it needs to buy a lot of these foreign goods and services, because we typically sell foreign countries less products than we buy from them. And again, this is something we'll discuss later in the course, but if we owe foreigners money, we have to pay for it somehow, and that's usually done through borrowing. All right. So that now chapters 1 and 2, again, they're pretty introductory chapters. Let me just remind myself what chapter 3 is all about. Here it is. Okay, yes, this is a fairly complicated discussion, which actually helps us understand how and why trade takes place. But it's more general than that. It's basically an explanation as to how resources are allocated. It also reintroduces to us the concept of opportunity costs. So I tell you what, let's stop right here. We don't want to dive into something this complicated at almost 12 o'clock. So we'll stop here. We're now done with chapters 1 and 2. And let's see, today's Friday, so I'll see you again on Tuesday. So what I'd like to do is have you read through what we've done so far, and also start to read chapter 3 before I see you again on Tuesday. Other than that, just have a nice weekend. And remember, Monday is a holiday, so you don't have school on Monday. So you're getting ready to have a nice 3-day weekend. So your job is to have fun during that 3-day weekend, but don't forget to look at these notes. All right, so I'll see you all next week. All right. Okay, you're welcome. Okay. Oh, Fernando, yes.
Can I stay after class to ask you a quick question?
Yes.
Awesome.
I just wanted to say, sorry I was late, Professor. I didn't get the email that said that the class was on Friday as well. And
Oh.
I was looking for the email that you sent, and I chose it at the beginning of the class when you sent the one that had the Tuesdays Zoom link.
Oh, yeah. You know what that is? The Zoom, the way the Zoom is set up, they don't give you the capability of having 2 days a week. So the only option I have is to have one invitation for Tuesdays and one for Fridays. So yes, we'll be here every Tuesday and Friday.
Okay, so sorry I was late today. I hope that doesn't
That's
count
right.
against me.
No, you're fine.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. Bye. All right. Here we go. Oh, Ishan, do you have a question too? No, maybe not.
No, I'm sorry.
Okay. So Fernando, do you want to?
What happened, Professor?
Oh, yeah, do you have a question?
Yeah. It's just a quick question.
Yeah.
From the last chapter that when we went through about
Yes.
the scatter plots,
Yes.
I just want to ask, like, I never really fully got the full concept of scatter plot graphs, but like slowly but surely I'm understanding it.
Oh, good.
So when the line is drew like through like the points, the coordinates,
Yes.
what is that supposed to like signify? Like,
Oh, you know what that's supposed to be? It's like, you see how these points are scattered all over the place? The straight line gives us an opportunity to create an equation. And that means I can now use this to forecast what's going to happen. Let's say next year, I want to know if my sales are $20 million, where will my profits likely be? I can't really do that with a bunch of random points. So what I do is I create an equation. The straight line is an equation, which tells me how quickly these points are rising, so that I can use that to forecast what might happen in the future.
oh, okay. And the points in the bottom, well, like when it separates the points,
Right.
which is the equation you said,
Right.
what is like that also determine on like the coordinates?
Well, yeah, it's what it's attempting to do is get as close as possible to these points with the understanding that it's not going to be perfect. So it's basically an attempt to say, well, just in general, what's happening with this information? And so, it's a special approach that you have to take. The equations are very complicated, but it's an attempt to just get the line as close as possible to these points so that you can say, well, imagine if everything increased at the same rate every year, what would it look like? And that's what you've got. So it's really meant to give you a better sense of what this relationship looks like. Because you can see the points are all over the place. So you get a better feel for, on average, how fast is this rising. And I may also want to forecast what's happening in the future.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, that's really what it's used for. It's not necessary, but it helps you visually see what this relationship really looks like.
All right. Thank you, sir. I really
Okay. All right. Good. See you next
also
time.
I also need to work on the pre-calculus assignment number 1, right? That's due next week, Wednesday.
Oh, yes, that's right. What we're going to do is we're going to go over that in class just to make sure you understood what we were doing.
Okay.
I'm not going to collect it or grade it, but we're going to go over it together. And it's pretty straightforward. That one you shouldn't have any trouble with.
Wait, sorry, you said there's an assignment due when?
No, he's in my pre-calculus class as well as this one.
Oh,
yeah.
okay, so not for my class.
Yeah, no, not you guys. You're all set. Don't worry
Okay,
about
can
it.
I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Are you gonna have office hours for my class, like ever?
Well, only if you want them. In other words, it's something that has to be arranged, because otherwise, being online, you can't really have office hours. So what I would do is say, if you want to meet up, we have to get together by email and figure out what time would work for both of us. And then I can create a Zoom meeting like this one.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Anybody else?
Also like a one-on-one individual meeting.
Yes, exactly. You can have a
Alright.
one-on-one, but we just have to
Yeah.
figure out when it works for
Oh,
both
of course,
us.
yeah, of course. But yeah, just work on it. Just look over the notes pretty much because everything we went through in class
Yes.
that day is just pretty much the.
Yeah. Just keep an eye on the notes. That's all.
All right, I really appreciate it. Thank you,
Okay,
Professor.
good. All right, you're welcome.
All right, have a great weekend and enjoy your shift as well.
All right, bye.
Thank you for class.
Okay, you're welcome.